My name is Tobias. I am 38 years old, and I drove 4 hours to visit the land my grandfather left me because I had not seen it in 6 months, and I missed the way it looked in October, when the grass along the eastern fence turns a pale gold and the old mango trees drop their last fruit of the season. I turned off the main road onto the dirt track, and that is when I saw it. A white signboard, freshly planted at the entrance gate. Bold red letters. Sold. I sat in the car for a full minute without moving. The engine was still running. The radio was still playing. I turned the radio off because I needed the silence to be complete. Then I drove up the track to the main house where my father Clement lives. He was standing on the veranda when I pulled in, wearing his good trousers and a pressed shirt, the way he dresses when he wants to look like a man who has everything in order. He smiled when he saw me, wide and easy, as if this were any ordinary Sunday. I looked at the smile. I looked at the sign I had passed. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my old room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me with sounds that used to feel familiar, and now felt like something closing in. In the morning I walked the full boundary slowly. 6 acres. My grandfather Ezra had bought the first 2 with money saved over 12 years. He bought the remaining 4 from a neighbor leaving the district. He registered every inch properly, kept every receipt. When he died he left the land to me specifically, not to my father, not split among the grandchildren. Me. As I walked I noticed a man I did not recognize pacing the eastern fence line with a clipboard. He did not see me. 2 neighbors, Mr. Asante and his wife, watched from their yard. Mr. Asante raised his hand when he saw me. Not a wave. More like an acknowledgement people give when they feel sorry for someone but do not know what to say. Kept walking. When I returned I overheard a neighbor I had known since childhood say to my father's friend, in a voice not quite quiet enough, "That land was never really going to stay with the boy anyway." I went inside. I asked my father to see the full sale contract. He handed it over without hesitation, the way a man hands over something when he is certain it contains nothing that can be used against him. He sat across from me eating groundnuts while I read every clause. The buyer's price was below market value for the district. There were clauses giving the buyer early access before final registration, which was unusual. There was a clause waiving the 90-day dispute window, which was more unusual still. My father said the buyer was a serious man who moved quickly and did not like delays. I turned to page 7. A clause concerning co-ownership stated that all registered parties had been duly notified and had consented to the transaction. I had never been notified. I had not consented. I turned to the next page. A secondary beneficiary of the sale proceeds was named. The name was not my father's. I set the contract down. I thanked my father for letting me read it. I told him I needed some air. Outside, I took my phone from my pocket and photographed every page of the contract carefully, from the first line to the last signature. On the drive back I called my sister Amara. She is 2 years younger than me and has always been closer to our father. I told her everything. The sign, the contract, the consent clause that listed me as having agreed, the secondary beneficiary whose name I did not recognize. There was a long silence. Then Amara said, "Tobias, maybe you should let it go. Papa knows what he is doing." The land was not generating anything anyway. I asked her when she had last spoken to our father about the sale. Another silence. Shorter this time. She said, "I just think some things are better left alone." Thanked her. Said good night. I ended the call. I drove the rest of the way in silence, thinking about what she had not said. At some point I realized she had used my father's exact phrasing. The land was not generating anything. That was the phrase he had used at dinner the previous Christmas, before I had any reason to think about the sale. She had known before I arrived and found the sign. She had been sitting with that knowledge and had said nothing. She said she would tell me more when the time was right. The buyer's name was Rowan Decker. I found this in the contract and confirmed it through public business records. He was 44 years old, ran a small property development company incorporated 3 years earlier, and had completed 2 commercial projects in districts similar to ours. He arrived the following Wednesday to conduct what the contract called a preliminary site inspection. My father had called to tell me in a tone that expected shared enthusiasm. I drove back without telling my father I was coming. I parked on the service road along the western boundary and watched from a distance. Decker moved through the land with the particular confidence of a man who considers everything he surveys to already belong to him. He stopped near the northern corner where the old storage structure sits half hidden behind the mango trees. My grandfather built it in the 1980s from concrete block, partially sunk into the ground for temperature regulation. From a distance it looks like a low wall. The sale contract had not mentioned it. Decker pointed at it and asked my father's foreman a question. The foreman shrugged. Decker wrote something on his clipboard. He did not know what was inside the structure. But I did. I spent 10 days doing what I do for a living. I am a data analyst. I follow information trails and find the thing that does not fit the pattern. Mr. Asante agreed to meet me one evening. He told me my father had been meeting regularly with a man from the local land registry office over 2 months prior to the sale. Not in any official capacity. In the evenings at the small chop bar near the main road. 3 or 4 times. He wrote the name on a piece of paper and slid it across the table. Edmund Boa. Senior Clerk, District Land Registry. I asked if Mr. Asante was willing to sign a statement about what he had observed. He thought for a long time. Then he said yes. Other neighbors gave me smaller pieces. A woman who sold near the estate gate had seen my father and Decker together twice before any public offer was announced, meaning they knew each other beforehand. A laborer remembered being told to remove boundary markers on the eastern side and replace them slightly inward, which would reduce the measured acreage. Each piece meant little alone. Together they were forming a shape I recognized. Not a story of one bad decision. While my father was in town one afternoon, I asked his housekeeper if I could look through the storage room. She has worked for our family 20 years. She looked at me with the expression of someone who is glad to be asked rather than having to offer. In a box at the back, under old newspapers, I found a folder. Inside were documents going back 11 years. Letters between my father and various parties about the land, typed and handwritten, showing a consistent pattern. Every 3 or 4 years he had made some attempt to find a buyer. Each time something had stopped it. Once a legal query. Once my grandfather himself, who had apparently heard about an approach and intervened. He had been planning this for over a decade, waiting for the moment my grandfather was gone and I was far enough away. Then I found something that stopped me entirely. Folded inside the back cover was an old deed. Handwritten, properly stamped, dated 31 years ago. It was the original co-ownership registration for the land. My grandfather's name. Mine. Not my father's name. Added when I was 7 years old, with a notation that the co-ownership would vest fully at my 25th birthday. I was now 38. My uncle Kweku hosted a birthday lunch for my aunt the following Saturday. My father came. Amara came with her husband. Various cousins filled the afternoon. I came too, because not coming would have told my father something he did not yet need to know. I watched him work the room. He is good at it. He moves through groups with charm, remembers details about people, uses them at exactly the right moment to make someone feel seen. He found a way to mention the sale briefly in each conversation, framing it as a sensible decision, a relief, the right thing for the family. He was managing the narrative before there was any challenge to it. That told me he was less confident than he appeared. My cousin Didi found me near the food table. She is my Uncle Kweku's daughter and has never had patience for pretending. She stood beside me without looking at me and spoke quietly. She said, "I was at a family meeting 6 months ago. You were not invited. Your father told everyone to support him and say nothing to you until the sale was finalized." I asked if she had agreed. She said she had felt she had no choice at the time. My father called me on a Tuesday evening. His voice had changed from the easy, expansive tone he had used at the family gathering. Something tighter sat underneath it now. He said he had heard I was asking questions, talking to neighbors. going through things at the house. I told him I was simply trying to understand the process, that I was not comfortable being uninformed about matters that concerned me. He said, "This is adult business, Tobias. Your grandfather put your name on things he should not have, and I have spent years trying to correct what he complicated." I let that sit. Then I said I appreciated him explaining his perspective and would take it into account. He seemed to relax slightly. Before ending the call, he added that Rowan Decker had been asking about title irregularities, and he hoped I had not been speaking to anyone who might have given Decker the wrong impression. I said I had not spoken to Decker directly. That was true. I ended the call and opened my notebook. I wrote down the phrase, title irregularities. My father had used those words himself, which meant Decker was already uneasy. And my father knew it. Something somewhere had already reached the buyer. The letters from my father's folder covered 11 years of planning, but the ones from the final 18 months were the most important. Several were from a man whose name matched a silent partner in Rowan Decker's development company. These letters discussed the land in terms showing the purchase interest had been coordinated long before any formal offer. One referenced a private survey commissioned without my knowledge. Another discussed the storage structure, describing it as a liability to be addressed during transfer. But the fourth letter changed everything. It was dated 14 months before the sale and addressed to my father by his first name. It outlined a separate payment arrangement. Not the purchase price. A facilitation fee, listed clearly by amount, paid to an account outside my father's primary banking. Below the amount was a name. Edmund Boa. The same name Mr. Asante had written on a piece of paper and slid across the table to me. The senior clerk at the district land registry had received money connected to this transaction. This was no longer a family disagreement about inheritance. This was something that extended into the public institutions meant to protect land rights. I photographed every letter, emailed the photographs to myself and to a secure cloud account. My cousin Dee Dee called me 9 days after the family lunch. She had been thinking, she said, about what she knew and what it meant to remain silent. She told me that 6 months before the sale was announced, my father had asked her to help organize some documents and scan a specific file to email to an address she did not recognize. She had done it without asking questions. After our conversation at the lunch, she had searched her sent messages and found the email. The attachment was a private valuation report for the land, commissioned without my knowledge. The figure it contained was significantly higher than the price stated in the sale contract. Someone had ordered an accurate valuation, then sold the land for considerably less than its assessed worth. The difference between the private valuation and the stated sale price was substantial enough to explain a facilitation payment. Substantial enough to explain Edmund Boa's name in a letter about money. Dee Dee said she was willing to give me a printed copy of the sent email with the attachment. I asked if she was certain. She said yes. She said she had 3 children, and the idea of them growing up in a family where this was considered acceptable made her feel sick. I contacted a lawyer named Abina Sarpong through a colleague's referral. She agreed to meet me on a Thursday morning. I brought everything. The photographed contract, the co-ownership deed, the letters from the folder, Dee Dee's email printout, Mr. Asante's signed statement, my own documented notes. Abina read through everything without speaking. When she reached the co-ownership deed, she set it down and looked at me over her reading glasses. She said, "If this deed was properly registered, your father could not legally sell this land without your consent. Not a single acre of it." I told her I believed it had been registered correctly, but that the registry records might have been altered. She said that was the right concern. She would make a discreet inquiry with a contact at the National Land Commission who worked outside the district office chain. She also said the 90-day dispute waiver in the contract was potentially invalid on its face, because a co-owner cannot waive rights on behalf of another co-owner. She set her pen down. "Mr. Tobias," she said, "your father may have sold something he did not have the legal authority to sell." I told her to proceed. She opened a fresh file, wrote my name on the tab, and set it on top of her desk. I walked into the gathering my father arranged 3 weeks later at the family house, framed as a casual visit. When I arrived, I found 12 relatives, and the conversation had a prepared quality, topics arriving in an arranged order. He told the story of the sale the way a man tells a rehearsed story. The land had been idle. The offer was fair. He had made a decision for the family's benefit. Several relatives nodded. An aunt said he had done the right thing. I sat in the corner and let it happen. I watched who nodded and who did not. I watched who avoided my eyes and who met them directly. My father glanced at me twice. The first time his expression was triumphant. The second time, when he perhaps noticed I had said nothing in disagreement, something shifted in his face. Something closer to uncertain. He did not understand why I was calm. Men who expect to be fought are always unsettled by silence. As people were leaving, my father's oldest friend Clifford pulled me quietly aside near the gate. He said, "I know what your grandfather intended for this land, Tobias. I was there when he registered it." Clifford and I met at a quiet restaurant 2 days later. He is 71 years old and speaks with the care of someone who has learned over a long life that words said carefully outlast words said quickly. He told me he had been present when my grandfather registered the co-ownership. He remembered it clearly because my grandfather had insisted on a specific Saturday so that Clifford could serve as witness. He remembered the clerk. He remembered the fee paid. He remembered my grandfather folding the receipt into his breast pocket and saying quietly that he was making sure the land went where it was supposed to go. Clifford was willing to provide a sworn statement. Then he told me something he had not planned to say until he was sitting across from me and decided that staying silent made him complicit. He had been at my father's house helping move furniture when he noticed the laptop open on the dining table. He had seen only the first 2 lines of the email on screen before my father returned and closed it. But those 2 lines had stayed with him because the phrase disturbed him. The phrase was, "Once the registry issue is resolved." I drove to the family house on a Saturday morning 3 weeks before the legal closing date. My father was reading in the sitting room. I sat across from him and placed 1 sheet of paper on the table. A copy of the co-ownership deed. I did not accuse him of anything. I said calmly that I had found this document and thought he should know I had it. I said I was trying to understand the situation fully before deciding how to proceed. I said I was not angry. Every word of that was true. He looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at me. He said, "That document is very old. Registration records are updated regularly, and older instruments are sometimes superseded." I told him I had been advised differently. He said, "By whom? You have been speaking to lawyers." I had not mentioned lawyers. I had said only that I had been advised. He assumed lawyers because he already knew that a legal challenge was the only thing he had reason to fear. He recovered and said the sale was already finalized and nothing could be done. I thanked him for his time and stood to leave. Abina called me on a Monday with findings from her contact at the National Land Commission. The co-ownership registration had existed in the system. Past tense. The original entry, showing joint registration in my grandfather's name and mine, had been replaced with an entry showing sole ownership in my father's name. The modification had been made 11 months ago by a user account registered to Edmund Boa. The system logs had captured every detail. The timestamp, the user ID, the original entry, and the replacement, all preserved in the audit trail, which Boa had apparently not known about or had underestimated. Abina said this was now beyond a civil land dispute. What Boa had done was criminal falsification of public records. What my father had done, if he had instructed or facilitated it, was potentially conspiracy to commit fraud. I asked what we needed to proceed with the legal challenge. She listed everything. The original deed. The audit trail documentation. Clifford's sworn statement. Didi's email printout. Mr. Asante's statement. The letters from the folder. I told her I had all of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is one more thing. The specific letter naming Boa and the payment amount." The legal closing date came on a Wednesday. Rowan Decker and my father signed the final transfer documents at the district registry office. I knew the date because Didi had been asked to bring refreshments and kept me informed. I did not go to the office. I did not call. I sent no message. Abina had advised me to let the closing happen. She said a challenged sale that had formally closed was easier to void than one interrupted before completion. Interruption gave the other side time to regroup. Letting it close meant they were fully committed, everything on the table, no retreating. That afternoon I drove to the estate and parked on the service road. I sat with the window down and listened. The birds in the mango trees. The wind along the eastern fence. The distant sound of a vehicle on the main road. My grandfather had sat under the largest mango tree the summer before he died and told me I was the one who understood what land meant. He meant something about continuity. The difference between people who hold things in trust for the future and those who convert everything they touch into money as quickly as possible. I sat until dark. I showed the message to Abina the following morning. She read it carefully and said, "Something your father told him is not matching the documents received at closing. He is feeling for the edges of the problem." I asked what I should do. She said to respond simply, confirming I was aware of concerns and was also reviewing the transaction, and that I would be in touch through proper channels shortly. Nothing constituting a legal position. I sent exactly that message. The response came within 2 hours. Decker's lawyer asked if I was aware of any prior registration claim on the property. Abina said, "He has already done his own search and found something. He is trying to determine whether you know what he knows." A worried buyer who has just signed a transfer of title is an extremely useful thing when you are building a case to void that transfer. Abina filed a protective notice with the National Land Commission the same afternoon, flagging the property against any further transactions pending resolution of a disputed claim. The notice would appear in any title search conducted on the property. Decker's lawyer would see it within days. My father received a copy by registered post 48 hours later. Abina found witnesses through the network good lawyers build over years of careful work. Edmund Boa had not acted alone. 2 former registry colleagues were willing to provide statements about irregular modifications they had observed him make over several years. Neither had reported it at the time. Both were willing to do so now. A forensic document examiner reviewed the letters from my father's folder and confirmed the letter naming Boa and the payment amount was genuine. The handwriting, paper, and ink were all consistent with the stated date. Clifford gave his sworn statement in Abina's office on a quiet Tuesday. He sat upright, spoke clearly, and signed without hesitation when the statement was read back to him. Didi submitted her email records and a written account of what she had been asked to do. Mr. Asante submitted his signed statement. I submitted my own account, documented chronologically from the day I found the sign through every conversation and discovery that followed. Abina filed the formal legal challenge on a Friday morning on 3 grounds: fraudulent suppression of a co-ownership right, falsification of public registry records, and sale without the consent of a registered co-owner. The buyer now had serious questions about whether the seller had ever had the right to sell. The family response arrived not through direct confrontation but through a series of increasingly strained social occasions where everyone pretended to behave normally while understanding that nothing was normal. My aunt called to say she hoped this could be resolved without more conflict. I thanked her and said I hoped the same, and that the most direct route to resolution was honesty, which was true. My uncle Kweku said at a gathering that the family was being torn apart and some things were better settled privately. I told him I agreed and had been open to private settlement from the beginning. He had nothing more to say. Amara called for the first time since our initial conversation. Her tone was different, less certain. She said she had not known everything when she told me to let it go. I believed her and said so. Then she said something unexpected. She had confronted our father after the legal notice arrived. He had not denied the co-ownership deed. He had told her the registration was an old technicality, and that his years of managing the land gave him the right to make decisions about it. She said, "He does not think he did anything wrong, Tobias." Abina submitted the full case to the district court on a Monday, describing it as the cleanest land fraud filing she had assembled in 14 years of practice. The audit trail from the National Land Commission showing BOA's modification of the registration was submitted as a primary exhibit. The original co-ownership deed was submitted. The letters, financial records, sworn statements, email evidence, and forensic document examination report all followed in precise sequence. The court issued a summons to my father the following Thursday. A separate referral regarding Edmund BOA and the falsification of public records was sent to the relevant authority. That process would run on its own timeline and was not within Abina's brief, but she had included all relevant documentation. I was at my apartment when Abina called to confirm the summons had been served. I made tea and sat at the window. My father called 20 minutes later. His voice was different from anything I had heard before. Not tight. Fractured. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he had always intended to do right by me. He said there were things I did not understand. I told him I would speak to him through our lawyers. He was quiet for a long moment. News moves through a district the way water moves through soil. Slowly at first, then everywhere at once. I do not know exactly how word spread beyond the court filing. Perhaps through the filing itself, a public document. Perhaps through one of the neighbors I had spoken to during my early research. Perhaps through Rowan Decker's own inquiries, which had become visible enough that people were aware a buyer was actively questioning his purchase. What I know is that within 2 weeks of the filing, my father could not attend any gathering without facing questions he could not answer comfortably. The narrative he had constructed, the decisive patriarch making difficult choices for the family, was competing with a different story. One involving a son who had arrived to find his land sold, a registry official who had falsified records, and a sale price set below a valuation that had been deliberately hidden. People do not need every fact to form a judgment. They need a shape. The shape of this story was not favorable to my father. Rowan Decker's lawyer sent Abina a formal letter asking what remedies the plaintiff would accept in lieu of voiding the transfer. Decker did not want land whose title was under legal challenge. My father came to Abina's office without an appointment on a Tuesday morning. She called me afterward so I would hear it from her first. He had arrived with a folder of selected documents he seemed to believe would counter the case. When the assistant explained that submissions needed to go through the court process, he became agitated and asked to speak to someone in authority. Abina saw him briefly, as a professional courtesy. He offered to restructure the financial terms of the sale, so I received a payment from the proceeds. She told him the matter was beyond financial restructuring and concerned the validity of the transfer itself. He suggested Decker might be willing to transfer a portion of the land back to me as a private resolution. She told him that was a matter for Decker's lawyers and her clients separately. He left without anything resolved. 2 days later, Clifford called me. My father had visited him at home and asked him to withdraw his statement, saying it was causing unnecessary family harm. Clifford had listened, then told my father that what he had written was true and he would not withdraw it. He had also told my father something else. The court hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning. Abina prepared me carefully. She said to dress professionally, speak only when addressed, and let the evidence carry the weight. I arrived early. My father came with a lawyer who seemed uncomfortable with what he was being asked to defend. The proceedings were methodical. The judge reviewed the co-ownership deed, the audit trail from the National Land Commission, the letters, and the sworn statements. She asked precise questions of both legal teams. My father's lawyer argued that years of sole management superseded the registered title. The judge noted this was not the legal standard. The hearing lasted 3 hours. At the end, the judge stated her finding clearly. The original co-ownership registration was valid and had been improperly modified in the Land Commission system. The sale had proceeded without the consent of a registered co-owner. The transfer was void. My father sat very still. Decker's lawyer was already leaving before she finished. Abina shook my hand outside the courthouse. She said the formal restoration of the registration would take approximately 6 weeks. On the drive back, I stopped at the estate. I stood at the entrance where the sold sign had been. Someone had removed it in the weeks since the filing. 6 weeks later, Abina filed the restoration documents. The National Land Commission corrected the registration. The co-ownership record was restored exactly as my grandfather had entered it 31 years ago. Edmund Boa had been referred for criminal prosecution. That process was ongoing and not mine to manage. I drove to the estate on the first Saturday after confirmation. I walked the full boundary slowly the way I had walked it the morning after finding the sign. Along the fence lines. Through the mango grove. Past the storage structure behind the trees. October had arrived. The grass along the eastern fence had turned that pale gold I had driven 4 hours to see. Amara came that afternoon without calling ahead. She walked beside me for a while without speaking. Then she said she was sorry for not telling me sooner. I told her I understood, and I meant it, and that we would find our way back to each other because we are the only siblings we have. My father did not come. I had not expected him to and found I was not troubled by his absence the way I would have been before all of this. Some distances, once understood, cannot be pretended away. I did not hate him,